the morning of the 21st of October, 1600, more than 150,000 samurai stood in the fog of a narrow mountain valley in central Japan, waiting for the rain to stop. By mid-afternoon, it was over. One army had ceased to exist. Its commanders were fleeing into the hills, where most would be hunted down and executed within weeks. And a 60-year-old man who had spent his entire life waiting, surviving warlords who died young, outlasting rivals who moved too fast, had won control of Japan. 3 years later, Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun. His family would hold that title for 265 years. The peace that followed shut Japan's doors to most of the outside world, froze its social order in place, and only broke when American warships arrived in the harbor in 1853. All of it traces back to a single day in a valley called Sekigahara. But the story most people know, that Ieyasu won through superior tactics, is not quite right. Sekigahara was won before most of the fighting started, and it was decided by men who spent the morning standing on a mountainside doing absolutely nothing. This is what actually happened. To understand Sekigahara, you have to start with a death. For over a century, Japan had been tearing itself apart. This was the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, where the authority of the emperor was ceremonial. The old shogunate had collapsed, and regional warlords called daimyo fought each other for territory in a conflict that lasted generations. 3 men ended it. Oda Nobunaga began the unification through brutal, innovative warfare before being betrayed and killed by one of his own generals in 1582. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a foot soldier who rose to command armies, finished what Nobunaga started. By 1590, Hideyoshi controlled Japan. He was not from a noble family, which meant he could never legally hold the title of shogun. So he ruled through other offices and through a web of oaths, marriages, and hostages, binding every major daimyo to him personally. That system had one fatal weakness. It depended on Hideyoshi being alive. In 1598 he died, leaving as his heir a 5-year-old boy named Toyotomi Hideyoshi. To protect the child, he created a council of 5 of the most powerful lords in Japan, the Council of 5 Elders, who swore to govern jointly until Hideyoshi came of age. The senior member of that council was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the largest landholder in the country, with a power base in the east around a fishing town called Edo, which would one day be Tokyo. Hideyoshi essentially asked the 5 most powerful men in Japan to voluntarily not seize power. It held for about a year. The split that produced Sekigahara was not simply loyalists versus usurpers, though both sides claimed it was. Ieyasu began doing exactly what Hideyoshi's rules forbade, arranging marriage alliances between his family and other daimyo without council approval, and handing out rewards and appointments as though the decision were already his. Each move was small enough to argue about. Together, they were unmistakable. Opposing him was Ishida Mitsunari, an administrator rather than a battlefield commander, a man who had risen through Hideyoshi's bureaucracy and was fiercely loyal to the Toyotomi cause. He was also, by most accounts, difficult. He had made enemies of several senior generals during Hideyoshi's disastrous invasions of Korea, where the men doing the fighting resented the man doing the accounting. That personal friction mattered enormously, because when the country divided, a number of powerful commanders chose Ieyasu less out of belief in his cause than out of dislike for Mitsunari. In 1600, Ieyasu marched north against a daimyo named Uesugi Kagekatsu, deliberately leaving central Japan open. Mitsunari raised an army in his absence and declared him a traitor to the Toyotomi. Ieyasu turned his forces around and came west. The 2 armies converged on Sekigahara, a basin where several major roads meet, hemmed in by mountains. Roughly 80,000 men on each side, though as with all pre-modern battles, those figures come from later accounts and should be treated as estimates. Here is the strange thing about Sekigahara. On paper, Mitsunari had the better position. His forces held the high ground on the western and southern edges of the valley. Ieyasu's army was strung out along the road below, having marched in overnight through rain. A military analyst looking only at the terrain and the deployment would have called it for the Western Army. The armies took position in the dark. Fog filled the basin so thickly that neither side could see the other. Around 8 in the morning it began to lift, and the fighting started almost immediately. For 2 to 3 hours it was genuinely close. The Western Army units that engaged, particularly the forces under Ukita Hide and Otani Yoshitsugu, fought hard and held. Mitsunari's own position came under repeated attack and did not break. But something was wrong. Mitsunari signaled repeatedly for his reserves to join the battle. On Mount Nangu, a substantial force under Mori Terumoto's relatives sat completely still. On Mount Matsuo, a young lord named Tokugawa Hideyoshi commanded around 15,000 men, one of the largest single contingents on the field, and did nothing at all. They were not confused. They had already been in contact with Ieyasu. If you're getting something out of this, take a second to hit subscribe. The channel goes deep on the turning points that get compressed into a sentence in most history classes. The Mori contingent on Mount Nangu had made a private arrangement with Ieyasu's side and were physically blocked from advancing by the units in front of them, who had also agreed not to fight. An entire wing of the Western Army had been neutralized without a single arrow being loosed. Tokugawa Hideyoshi was the bigger prize, and the more uncertain one. Ieyasu had been negotiating with him for weeks. Hideyoshi had committed to nothing, and by late morning he was still sitting on the mountain watching two armies destroy each other, waiting to see which way it would go. The traditional account, popularized in later chronicles, is that Ieyasu lost patience and ordered his arquebusiers to fire on Hideyoshi's position to force a decision. Historians debate whether this happened. It appears in some sources and not others, and it has the shape of a story improved in the retelling. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Sometime around midday, Tokugawa's forces came down off Mount Matsuo and attacked the Western Army. They struck Otani Yoshitsugu's position on the western left. Otani had reportedly anticipated exactly this and held for a time. But as more wavering commanders followed Tokugawa's lead and switched sides, his position was overwhelmed. Otani, who was gravely ill and by tradition had been carried to the field in a palanquin, took his own life rather than be captured. The western left folded. The collapse rolled inward along the line. Within a couple of hours, the army that had held the high ground that morning had disintegrated. Ishida Mitsunari fled into the mountains. He was captured within days, paraded through the streets, and beheaded in Kyoto alongside two other Western commanders. Winning the battle was one thing. What Ieyasu did afterward is why the outcome lasted 2.5 centuries. He redistributed land on an enormous scale, stripping domains from defeated enemies, reducing others, and rewarding those who had supported him or defected at the right moment. But the redistribution was strategic rather than merely punitive. He sorted the daimyo into categories: the Fudai, hereditary Tokugawa vassals, and the Tozama, the outside lords, who had submitted only after Sekigahara. The Tozama kept large domains, but those domains were placed at the geographic edges of Japan, with loyal Fudai holdings positioned between them and the capital. Distance and geography did the work that constant surveillance could not. In 1603, the emperor granted Ieyasu the title of shogun. 2 years later, he formally resigned it in favor of his son, a deliberate demonstration that the office was now hereditary Tokugawa property, not a personal reward. He continued to hold real power from retirement until his death. The Toyotomi Wentai remained. Hideyori was still alive, still in Osaka Castle, still a rallying point. Ieyasu resolved it in the sieges of Osaka in 1614 and 1615, which ended with the castle taken and the Toyotomi line extinguished. He died the following year, at 73, with the settlement secure. What followed was the Edo period, over 2 centuries with no major internal war, a rigid 4-tier social order, tightly restricted foreign contact, and a samurai class that gradually became administrators rather than warriors. Whether that stability is best understood as a golden age or as a long stagnation is still argued about, and reasonable historians land in different places. Sekigahara is often described as the greatest samurai battle ever fought, and by scale, that is fair. It is also, more interestingly, a battle that was largely won away from the battlefield. Ieyasu's real achievement was not tactical. It was that by the morning of the fight, he had already secured private understandings with enough of his enemy's commanders that the Western army was structurally incapable of winning, no matter how well its frontline units performed. Mitsunari commanded roughly 80,000 men. A significant portion of them were never going to fight for him. That is worth sitting with. The men who decided the future of Japan for 265 years included several who spent the decisive morning standing on a hillside, watching and choosing the moment to move. 6 hours in a foggy valley, 2.5 centuries of consequences.